The women, they stay home and they provide all of the child care for their children. They go out and they find wood and they cook the food over the wood that they find. They go and they fetch water, otherwise there would be no clean water to drink. They wash the clothes while they're down there at the places where they fetch the water. I lived in DR Congo for almost 5 years, back in the 80s. I know that sounds like a very long time ago, and it was. I was 4 at the time. And but I got to see these wonderful, wonderful people struggling and working hard and managing to do all of these kinds of activities, and the women were absolutely the backbone of the society. One way you could tell that is that when a thief stole the mill motor from the hospital where I was in charge of the maintenance of the hospital, the women went marching down the road holding up their bedia sticks in the air. Now bedia is like this white Play-Doh-like material that tastes kind of like Play-Doh too. It's really pretty lacking in nourishment, but it's made of cassava, manioc, a very easy to grow plant. And they did not want to have to be beating it like with a mortar and pestle themselves. And so they basically went walking down the path, holding up their bedia sticks until they found the local thief. Someone turned him in and they were able to get their mill motor back. All right, we don't have any visuals, so I'm just going to try to help you to generate some mental images. First of all, how many of you know, raise your hand if you know, how we got our name? 5 talents. Okay, less than half. So you all probably have heard in Matthew chapter 25, which actually covers a whole lot of things, including the Great Commission and other things, but in the center of Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells this wonderful parable about 3 servants. One servant got 1 talent, one servant got 3 talents, the other one got 5 talents. Now we normally think of Jesus as being very loving and caring and really, you know, supporting people who are impoverished or people who are downcast in their society. Well, I got to tell you, in this particular parable, Jesus is really kind of mean. He basically says to this lazy old servant who was scared, I mean, the guy wasn't lazy, he was scared. He buried his 1 talent. So when his owner comes back, he says, here's the 1 talent that you gave me. I was afraid to do anything with it. Meanwhile, the servant who had 5 talents, he went out and he invested them and managed to give back to his master 10 talents. So why on earth would Jesus be so hard on someone who was just scared? This poor person who had 1 talent and gave back his 1 talent because he was afraid. He says, I know that you're a really strict master. Why do you think he was so hard on him? I think it's because Jesus knew human nature. He knew human nature in ways that we just really need to pay more attention. He understood that people feel really good. Their self-esteem is raised when they are working, when they are multiplying their talents. Okay, so what's a talent? Well, talent at the time, you know, could have referred to a coin, but it also could have referred to the talents that God gives every person. And so I think it was so important to Jesus that people not wallow in self-pity or poverty or inability to act, that he ended up telling this incredible parable that says, even if you're scared, even if it takes a tremendous act of faith, you need to go out and multiply the things that God is giving you. Now, if we had the slides up here, what I would be showing you next is this picture of these women who are just laughing and having a great time in the village. What I want you to understand is that 5 Talents is not working with people around the world with the support of you and other churches because we feel sorry for them or because they feel sorry for themselves. These are people who are laughing and working and thriving, and all we're doing is helping to teach them to do things for one another. We don't have Americans or Europeans doing the training. We basically train trainers who are local people. We have local people who are running these programs. During COVID, when we couldn't get on any airplanes, the programs continued just great because the local people could run these programs at least as well as we could do anything. And so that was an important lesson for us, because I tell you, we wanted to keep getting on airplanes. We wanted to keep getting out there and helping them, right? There's so many things where Americans and Europeans and other people of privilege, people who are in rich countries, you know, we want to give, we want to give, we want to do for people. It used to be 20 years ago, we would send people out on mission trips where they would do a lot of the teaching. Well, what we learned is that that was very expensive, and they really didn't do as good a job as the local people did. And so now we pour all of the contributions that come into 5 Talents into training local people, who then go on and train hundreds of other trainers, and they are the ones that help to teach people how to run these programs. Now, my wife tells me every time she hears me do one of these presentations, honey, you forgot to really tell them how the program actually works. So, step 1 is that we move into a new geographical area, and this is in some of the very poorest countries of the world. Places like South Sudan and Tanzania and Uganda and Burundi. What do you think the United Nations calls the poorest country in the world in terms of lack of money, high illiteracy rates, infant mortality rate? What do you think is the country that is struggling most in the entire world, according to the UN? What's that? Niger? Good guess. Yeah, Niger is probably top 5. South Sudan right now. Sudan, you're saying? Yeah, actually in the last 9 months it may have become Sudan. But Sudan actually had quite a bit of resources before the war broke out there about 1.5 years ago. So at least up until the impacts of that war, South Sudan, which underwent almost 40 years of conflict, was the most impoverished country in the world. And so anyway, we move into a new area, like about 3 years ago when we moved into Terekeka, and we convene the local leaders, usually of the Episcopal or Anglican Church. Internationally, it's generally referred to as the Worldwide Anglican Communion. And so we'll get bishops and their local leaders, and we'll say, you know, if you can pull together all of the program participants that are necessary to run this thing, then we will provide the financing to do the training of trainers. And so then they decide, you know, where is the best geographical area? Where is there enough stability that the program is not going to just fall apart? And in an area like South Sudan or Burundi, that's critical. You all have probably heard of Hotel Rwanda and all of the genocide that occurred there. Well, the country used to be called Rwanda, Burundi. And so the southern half of that, which is now broken off to be a separate country, is also one of the 5 poorest countries in the whole world. And so in Burundi and in South Sudan and elsewhere where we choose to work in the most challenging countries, that's where these programs are flourishing. So anyway, we go in, we talk to the local leaders, they start forming groups. What do you think the first thing is that people need in order to be able to do microenterprise development, savings groups? What do you think they need?
Money.
Nope. Not money. They need to be able to read and write in their own native language. Never mind French or English or anything else that may be used by the government. Even if there's like 50 to 100 mother tongues in a country, the first thing they need is just to be able to read and write in their own language. And so they go through about 6 months of literacy training. And then after that, once they've had that time to graduate, I mean, I've handed out diplomas. They do all this on blackboards with real chalk and old-fashioned blackboards, and it's often underneath of a tree where you'll have 50 people gathered under a giant tree. Once they learn how to read and write, good. Then you can see them gathering under the trees right there. And those are the countries, the 9 countries around the world where we work. 7 of them are in Central and East Africa. And these are the steps that I was just starting to go through. So after they learn how to read and write, then they start saving for about 6 months. Now, where do these people get money to save? These are some of the poorest people in the world. This is not like they just go and make withdrawals from their bank account. But somehow, some way, even if it's only 10 to 20 cents per month, they save a little bit. They manage to scrape together from family members sometimes very small amounts of money. And so by the end of a year, if they've even saved $20 to $40, then they're able to take out loans from the group. Because not everyone who participates in a savings group ends up taking out loans or starting a business. By the end of about a 3-year cycle, it can be as much as about 75% of the participants. But at first, it may only be a group of like about 30 or 40% who actually take out loans and start businesses. So you'd think that you'd have to have like hundreds or thousands of dollars to start a business. But many of these folks can start a business with as little as $50. Now, a business may be as simple as buying beans and then selling them in the marketplace, or buying lamb meat and making a stew and selling that to the business folks who come through on their motorcycles and cars as they're passing through their village. But it's amazing what they can do with so little money. And then, during that first year, they pay back what they've borrowed. Now, the local groups decide who gets to borrow money and what conditions. We don't have anything to do with that. I've had people call me on the phone and say, you know, I want to be able to start a program in India, and how am I going to enforce it? And I just had to tell the person, you can't enforce this. This has to be done by local leaders. And so the local leaders decide what interest rate is going to be charged, how long they have to pay it back. And so the good thing is that most of these businesses will able to pay back their loans in like 3 to 9 months. And so that means that there's no continuing debt. If you've ever heard anything negative about microfinance programs, it's usually that sometimes people get strung out on debt. Doesn't happen with local savings groups that are being led locally, because there's nobody off in a foreign country who's demanding interest payments be sent across the Atlantic to come back into the coffers in the United States. Everything stays within the country and is run locally. So they get paid, they pay interest on what they're borrowing, which means that there's more money put into the pot, and then more loans can come out, and the whole thing becomes self-sustaining. Now, how long do you think it takes before something this transformative, this dynamic, can actually become self-sustaining? That's exactly right. It usually only takes about 2.5 to 3 years before these folks are independent. Now, I actually have these are, I mentioned a minute ago about some of the things that they do with their loans. And, okay, pigs and mobile phones. And by the way, I saw one of the coolest things one time. This guy actually created a little drive-in theater, which was a sit-in theater. I mean, it was a thatched roof, and he had like an old CRT television, one of these 50-pound televisions sitting up in the corner. And he would charge people to come in and watch soccer matches. And so he put up a tiny satellite dish that was run by solar power, and he would charge everyone to come in to have like this little theater experience. And then he used that to invest in cell phone chargers. And so he had, sitting out on a piece of plywood, like the ability to charge 20 cell phones at a time with all different kinds of attachments, and it was all being run off of solar panels. But look up there at the top where it says cattle. And if you notice, more men get cattle than women. When my wife and I were in Burundi one time, we hopped out of a Land Cruiser. We had, bounced our way over some dirt roads until we got to a path, and then we were being led down this path, and one of the local people said to me, "This woman, she has a cow." I'm like, okay. I've seen cows before. He says, no, you don't understand. This is a woman with a cow. Okay. Why are you so excited about this? He says, apparently you don't understand. In Burundi, women don't own cows. That's something that only men can do. But this woman started with chickens, and she eventually raised goats, and she made enough money from her goats that she was able to buy a cow. And she showed us, she was holding a little baby, she showed us her cow, and she was so proud of that cow that just, transformed her life and, in some ways, her society, because women don't own cows. So these are just big numbers to show you that this is not a tiny organization that's working at a garage somewhere. Five Talents now has about 15 or 20 staff worldwide, and we've got about a $3 million budget. And part of all that's been possible. It was very, very tiny when it started, but through the support of Immanuel Church on the Hill and others, it's just grown and grown and grown to the point where we've had an impact now on about 1.7 million people, and that's just extraordinary. So I talked with you earlier about Burundi and South Sudan as a couple of the places that are the most impoverished. In Burundi, and I mentioned this when I was here last time, almost 3% of the entire country who are literate now were enabled to be able to read and write through this program. I mean, can you imagine if 3% of the entire United States were able to read and write? And that's just from our tiny little nonprofit. I mean, Burundi is a relatively small country with only about 12 million people, but you know, with 6,200 savings groups in a small country, it's just extraordinary. So, an example of what people say when they join these programs was from this participant here in the Rumonga diocese. She said, "My parents never sent me to school, and it was believed that education was only for the boys. For the girls, their role was to do household chores. But after becoming literate, I decided to send my 10-year-old daughter to school so that she could escape the ignorance that I used to live with." And by the way, I hope you can sense in her tone of voice, people who can't read and write often demonstrate a lot of shame. And it's not their fault that they can't read and write. And so this transformation that occurs in their lives is often one of moving from shame to a sense of empowerment that is just palpable. I was able to support my daughter in school through the savings group, and I was also able to send her younger brother to school. Now I am happy. So another example of this kind of transformation occurred with a woman named Dee Dee. So this is what Dee Dee looked like. And notice Dee Dee is just so proud that she's got her goat there, that she's able to make money from the milk from her goat. She shared that she used to be very shy and would hide from people due to her shame. Yeah. She said, "I was hiding and was very dirty and couldn't wash my clothes. I didn't even have enough money to buy soap. I didn't feel worthy." But after joining the program, Dee Dee became literate and started to save very small amounts of money. From her first loan from the savings group, she bought mice. Yeah, you sometimes see them out where they're grilling them and they're on a stick, and yep, good old mice. Mice are an often very important source of protein in areas like this. So as her profits grew, she expanded to buy rabbits, and rabbits did what rabbits do. So they multiplied, and her profits increased, and then she was able to buy 2 goats, which again multiplied. And this progression has been continuing over a period of years until she bought a cow. This is not the same woman I was telling you about earlier. So Dee Dee is an example of an entrepreneurial woman who over the years has diversified businesses. I mean, think about it, mice, goats, and her children can go to school. She can provide for their needs, and she contributes to the economy. Okay, so that's an interesting point, because my sister asked me, well, wait a minute, where does the money come from? Is it just going from one hand into another hand? And the answer is no. All of these areas are involved in commerce with people, truckers, you know, moving in and out, ships coming, railways. I mean, you know, these countries are not isolated. Even these regions are not completely isolated. So what's happening is, as these people learn how to read and write and start their own businesses, then they're able to increase the entire economy, and everyone benefits. And I got to tell you, the local church leaders, they love this program, because parishioners who are in the greatest, you know, most poverty-stricken countries, they have almost nothing to give to their churches. There are very few pastors in poor countries that are actually paid for out of the congregation as a full-time salary. Almost all the pastors and priests have other jobs. But after people participating in these programs, they manage to have enough money that they can begin to put something in the offering plate. And so it transformed the church as well as other parts of the community. So we've talked a fair amount about Burundi and some extraordinary changes there. Let's talk a little bit more about South Sudan. We've been involved there really over 12 years now. The reason that $1.90 per day is referenced is because that's a UN benchmark for poverty. And so the fact that 82% of everyone in the country is living on less than $1.90 a day is a significant indicator that they're not going to be able to do other things. So because of that, there tends to be tremendous illiteracy and mortality. Women and children, of course, are the most affected, and like in our other programs, constitute about 80% of the participants. But it got worse. With the pandemic, hyperinflation went up to 28% just this last year in 2023. And over a 10-year period, the South Sudanese pound went from 6 pounds per dollar to 950 per dollar. So when we talk about bad inflation here of 20 or 40% over a period of years, it's nothing like what they've experienced, which is like 100,000% inflation. So therefore, the savings groups did some things like investing in specific assets like cows or in US dollars, things that would not deflate. And if you look at an example of what was going on in South Sudan, there's a little area in the northeastern corner that's kind of like a stovepipe that goes right up into Sudan. So as the gentleman here was saying earlier, because of the war in Sudan, you've now got situation in any of the border areas of South Sudan that have just gotten worse. 200,000 refugees have all fled into one area that's basically the size of, I'd say about twice the size of Alexandria, about the size of Fairfax County. And amazingly, every diocesan building is being used to shelter those refugees. So, whoops, sorry. If you think about it, these are some of the poorest people that I've ever met. These are people that had almost nothing. Thatched roofs, no bathrooms, little outhouse that were used by the community, no electricity, no running water, thatched roofs, dirt floors, and yet they have given of what they have so that these refugees pouring across the border would have a place to stay. Just an absolutely extraordinary story. It'd be nice if I could even get you the right slide. There we go. So therefore, in rank, there's no market, no supplies, because the border is closed. And to make matters worse, they're experiencing aspects of climate change where the Nile River and some of the tributaries going into the Nile have been creating huge flooding, and some of the crops have even been destroyed by the flooding. So what do you think they did when the poorest country in the world gets inundated by refugees and things get worse? The local leaders still managed to start 12 new literacy groups last year with 262 participants. I don't know how they did it, but it's just incredible. Before they went through the literacy training, only 11% of the learners could read or write in their mother tongue. And now 98% can read and 84% can write. So absolutely a miracle of transformation. And after forming those literacy groups, then they formed 11 new savings groups with 280 members. And women got vocational training in sewing and tailoring, and young adults even learned how to drive. So I told you, Julie, that we were going to share some good news. I am just absolutely inspired that people like this can take a situation that is so difficult and they can manage to do things for one another and for the people that have been coming in from Sudan. Now, one of the most challenging things over the last 5 to 10 years in South Sudan is that because of the 40 years of war that we spoke about just a minute ago, a UN expert said that almost every single person in the country has been traumatized in some way. And I had the opportunity a few years ago to work with an expert from Notre Dame University who had traveled there like half a dozen times, working with them on trying to figure out ways to alleviate trauma. So we've added trauma healing workshops, not therapy sessions, but workshops, where people can get together and share their common experiences about how there's been, most often, a family member who's been killed, often by the military or by the police. And ironically, the military and the police often participate in these trauma healing workshops. And it's just absolutely extraordinary. The poor young men who often gunned down and killed people during the war, they were traumatized. They didn't want to kill people. They were ordered to do this. And so to hear them going back and forth, there's been much crying and some really extraordinary healing. So this probably sounds like big challenges on the other side of the world. How can you all, as members of this church, help? Well, one thing is that during COVID, we developed a virtual tour to be able to visit with folks in Kenya. And so if you need a hip replacement or if you need anything else going on and you're not able to travel, then one thing you can do is you can host a virtual tour here, and we basically lead you through a couple hours where you get on an airplane and you land and you get orientation and you get a chance to exchange money and put it in the box and kind of go through a local savings group along with the participants in Kenya. And it's a lot of fun. I've had a chance to conduct it a couple times now for some local congregations, and so think about that maybe for this fall or something like that, because it could be a lot of fun. We also have some congregations who put together a group of like 4 to 8 people, and they'll do an actual congregational visit to a place like Uganda or Tanzania or Burundi, and that's the kind of thing that we can also arrange for you. Partnership with programs means that if there's a particular thing that catches your interest, like trauma healing or like literacy training, then let that be known to Liz Ha or Sarah Herndon, the staff who work here in the Fairfax area, and they can try to put together something for you where there's kind of some two-way communication, and so that your financial support actually helps to pay for what's going on there that's more specific and program-centered if there's something that just captures your attention. We always can use individual volunteers, especially to help us contact other people in your congregation. I hope that you will take time and pray for 5 Talents, because prayer is powerful and we need it. And then, of course, the whole thing that makes this work year after year is financial support. And you all have both been terrific ever since Everett Post used to work every year at the Pumpkin Patch. We've continued to get great support from your church that helps us through the Pumpkin Patch giving. But as with most churches, individual donors often end up making up the bulk of the contributions from any particular congregation. And so please pray about your ability to support us individually as well. Now, if you'd like to learn more, I'm about to stop talking and just take questions from you, but please note the website, 5 Talents, is spelled F-I-V-E, not with a numeral 5, and there's a tremendous amount of information, including some really fun videos on the website. And I've got some business cards that I can give you if you just want to have something to take with you to be able to remember the website. We used to print out pamphlets, but now we do it almost all electronically and just refer people to the website instead. So thank you for making time in the middle of a summer schedule, and let me take questions, please. Yes, Jim?
I was under a misconception. I thought that our financial contributions constituted the corpus of loans. And what you said is that they have to come up with a corpus of their loans themselves, or their savings.
That's exactly right. Yeah, when Muhammad Yusuf started the first microfinance program about 30 years ago in India. It was using that older style that you were referring to. People in the United States and Europe and Japan would donate money. It would form what you referred to as the corpus, which was essentially like an account out of which you could make a withdrawal and borrow money. The problem with that is that every time someone had a family member who got sick, every time someone got behind on repaying their loan for whatever reason, it was hard to pay someone 6,000 miles away on time. And so that system did not last very well, and people did tend to get strung out kind of in a cycle of debt. By contrast, with the local community, you know, if a man is a member of a savings group and he wants to take out 20 bucks and go out and buy a bunch of beer for his buddies, then the group won't lend it to him. But if another man wants to buy some seeds and help to grow food, and he already has enough access to some land that he can use, and he can prove that he can pay it back within a year, then he's essentially got a mini business plan. Then they will lend him the $40 to be able to get the seed and the fertilizer to be able to do something like that. And then all the members of that group who have put in their own money, they want him to succeed. So if they notice that his crops are dying because he doesn't have access to water, then they may be inclined to talk to him and say, hey, you know what? You need to be figuring out a way to do a better job of watering your crops because I want to get my loan paid back. And so it's a very self-reinforcing system where everyone is kind of rowing in the same direction. Everyone is trying to help their neighbors be successful. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Kenya and Uganda are poor countries, but they have substantially more resources than Burundi or South Sudan. What kind of activities do you have there? Because you said, I think, you have videos showing those activities.
Sure. Could everyone hear the question all right? Okay. So even though Kenya is sometimes known as the economic engine of East Africa, and therefore, yes, it has a lot more resources than a place like Tanzania or Burundi, it actually has more people living in severe poverty than Burundi or South Sudan do. Because Burundi and South Sudan both have like about 12 million people, and Kenya's got like about 60 million people. So there's a tremendous disparity in a place like Kenya, where in Nairobi there are, you know, luxury hotels and there are luxury houses and there is a lot of money and there are some businesses that are flourishing, but there are also tens of millions of people who are living in more rural areas who are in extreme poverty. So not surprisingly, we don't have any savings groups in Nairobi, the capital. We have savings groups in the areas where there's desperate poverty. Yes?
I don't get too bogged down in the industry in detail, but I would like to know how you as an organization go in to work in the country. Do you get invited there? Does someone know about it? How does that work? I assume you just don't go in and say, well, we like it here, we got to start a project.
No, that's a great question. So how do we get started in a given country? So far, all of the countries where we've been working, we have entered through the local church. And that's why we ended up discontinuing the work in Indonesia, because in Indonesia there was essentially a mission church there that was all fired up, but beyond that one mission church, there just wasn't an infrastructure of the church. So even in a place like Myanmar, which is extremely difficult to work in ever since the coup, there local church in Myanmar, I've met with the Archbishop there, and they are very active, and because he wants to run a program in his country, then the Mothers Union, are you all familiar with Mothers Union? It's basically the women's guild, or it's the very active and highly structured women's group internationally of the Anglican Church. And they usually have a development desk and a men's desk and a Mother's Union desk. And so Mother's Union tends to help women with things like how to avoid death during childbirth and how to make sure that children have access to adequate dental things and how to boil water so that children are not getting dysentery from their food. And so consequently, Mother's Union has been extremely helpful in implementing these savings groups as well. And to give credit to them, Mother's Union even was doing some literacy programs before we ever came along. I'm trying to remember if I actually answered your question now. Oh, so how we get started. We tend to attend international conferences where these bishops are, and we also tend to go through contacts of contacts. Now, you can talk with an archbishop and say, hey, how would you like to have a program in your country? And normally he'll say, oh, you're going to bring money to my country? Sure, I'm in favor of it. But that doesn't actually do much good. What you really need to do is figure out who the local bishops are that have caught fire. And if you've got a local bishop who recognizes how important this can be for his smaller geographical area, then that's usually where we'll end up starting the next program. And it kind of daisy chains because the surrounding areas hear about the success in a given geographical area and they say, wow, that's incredible, and your church is healthier now and people are making more contributions and I want that too. And so we actually normally have more bishops asking us to start programs than we have money to do the programs. Yes? Yeah.
It seems like that the resources locally go to paying trainers and perhaps literacy materials.
That's right. There's kind of a package that includes a chalkboard and chalk and a box, and the box has 3 padlocks on it, three different keys, and then when the local people elect a president and a treasurer and a secretary, each one of them takes one of the keys, and in the box is a series of pass books that are given out to every member, as well as kind of one bigger main book that keeps track of all the finances for that savings group. And so then over the next 6 months, the treasurer and the secretary or anybody else, who's interested in helping to provide leadership in the group, they get training in how to do the operations of the group. And then the group decides, are they going to meet weekly, are they going to meet bi-weekly, how are they going to divide up the money, how are they going to hand out the money, what are they going to do at the end of each year. They get to choose their own rules and they essentially write up a little written constitution. And it's really kind of cool to attend these meetings because what you see is that you open the box after you've unlocked the 3 locks, and then you pull out the passbook, and it'll say like, okay, there was 300,000 francs left in the box at the end of the last meeting. So you write up on the chalkboard 300,000, and then someone counts the money to make sure that it's all still there. Because graft is huge in most of these countries. And then everyone will come up and they'll put like their 10 or 20 francs into a plastic basket, and you write it up and you write it into the little passbook of each individual so that they're getting credit for how much more they're saving. And then you add it all up at the end and say, okay, instead of 300,000, we now have 380,000 francs. And then you count it all up again and make sure that you've got 380,000. Okay, and then you close the box and put the 3 locks on it, and you do the same thing again a couple weeks later. So the transparency is just phenomenal. And that's why I say, we don't have to run anything from the United States because they're doing all this locally. So it partly depends on what position. The 3 local people generally don't get anything. The ones who are fanning out to multiple villages and providing 6 months worth of training, at the very least, they get like this giant Christmas basket at the end of the year. And it'll often include cloth and fruit and some other things in the basket. But the amount of volunteerism is phenomenal. As a matter of fact, it's funny how sometimes people will criticize us for not taking credit for all of the in-kind money, but it's it's very difficult to calculate. Or they'll say, oh, you're making it sound like your program is cost effective, but you're not counting all of the volunteerism. Fine. The reason that it's cost effective is because there are so many people who are volunteering.
They also decide the interest rate, right?
That's right. So what would you guess is a typical interest rate? 1.5%, 2% sounds kind of low, right? Per month. So per year, it's often 18 to 24%, which sounds really high by US standards, where you're lucky if you can get 5% on a savings account. But the reason that it's so high is because these tend to be countries where there is a lot of inflation, and also where the loans do tend to get paid back very quickly. Oh, and where if you were going to a loan shark, if you were going to a for-profit competitor in the area, sometimes they charge as much as 10% per day, 3,600% per year. Yeah. Other questions? 25 years. Worldwide budget now is about $3 million. And in the US, it's about 1.3. And yeah, I mean, it's tiny compared to some of the big groups. I think World Vision's budget is like 3 to 4 billion per year or something like that. And it's just phenomenal how much they can do with very little money. Yes? Yeah. So it's, it's fascinating. Most of the time it just gets stored in someone's house. And obviously someone could break into a thatched roofed house with mud walls, but it's about as safe as anything else around there. And there's just a lot of social pressure to protect the box because it's everyone's money. But I saw a fascinating photograph once of where they had created this thing that was like 15 feet up in the air, and they were storing the box up in kind of what looked like a little lookout, where I guess they basically would go up with a ladder, put it back up there, and then take down the ladder, and supposedly no one could go back up. I don't know. It was just, I've only seen it once. But most of the time it's just in someone's house. And once the money begins to accumulate enough, once you get beyond, say, the $200 to $300 worth of assets in the box, if you've got a larger group or a more economically successful group, and you're starting to get more like $500 to $1,000 in the box, then they'll often work it out so that the treasurer can get a local bank at a nearby village, and they'll take like half the money or 3/4 of the money in the box, and they'll deposit it in a local bank. But I mean, most of these people live like a 2 to 3 hour walk from the nearest bank. So that's why it's really helpful to be able to have your own local savings group right there, and then leave it up to the treasurer to maybe once every 6 months, get the money deposited in a place that's got a real steel safe. Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yes. Uh-huh. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, what a great question. I don't really know how fast the transition will occur, but if I remember correctly, I think Impreza is the most commonly used system in Tanzania and Kenya. And anytime you're in a city or a decent sized town, there are local storefronts where you can set up an account and have it connected to your cell phone. And ironically, since I've seen some Americans try to do this, you have to show your passport and all before you can even get a cell phone number, because they're really trying to protect this little $20, flip phone, because it can represent a lot of money. The way that people have begun to use telecommunications in developing countries is nothing short of explosive, but it has not reached a lot of the poorest villages. And so there's still an awful lot of cash used at the local village level. Sure. Oh, that's right, I forgot. You've got an audience at home listening. Thank you, Tamika. Yes? So the question was, how does this compare to the heifer organization? So I've supported heifer myself for like 50 years. They're a terrific organization. Heifer actually does do some savings groups now. I'm not sure how recently they started doing them, but Five Talents is more than happy to share, the challenges of the world with dozens of other organizations, because we certainly can't do it ourselves. And so I'm really grateful that Heifer is involved in this. Most of Heifer's model, however, has been one of, especially around Christmas time, people, for an alternative Christmas gift, they choose whether or not they want to give a dozen chicks, or whether or not they want to give a goat, or whether or not they want to give half of a cow or something like that. And then, if I understand correctly how it works, at the local level, they tend to give those animals to the local people, and they continue to raise them in such a way that it helps them to reproduce and sell the milk and sell the eggs and all those sorts of things. I don't know the details of how they find their candidates to give an animal to, but I'm pretty sure that it is a gift. And so my preference would be to avoid gifts. I'll just give you a quick example of how it can relate to personal shame. You've probably seen these red and green shoeboxes that are sometimes collected around Christmas time that are given out to families, and we'll collect millions of those boxes in the United States and ship them over to give to families that are very poor. Well, there was a man in Tanzania, I think, who couldn't afford Christmas gifts for his own children, and he was very upset about it. And then along came the charity to the village and let them know that, gather your children together, in a day or so, because we're going to be coming back with these boxes. And so, the children were all excited, and they came and knocked on the front door and came in with like 5 of these boxes for his 5 children. And he went out the back door because he felt so much shame that he couldn't provide to his own children what this organization was giving them. And so, as much as possible, I think it's better to spend every penny on training so that the people are, back to the 5 talents, they're having to use their own talents. They're having to use their own resources to start a business, to learn how to read and write, to use all the gifts that God has given them. So, but it's a good organization. Yes?
Typically, how long does it take for someone who is illiterate to become literate enough to be able to really function with their income?
So the question was, how long does it take to become literate for those who are not? And the training usually lasts less than a year. Now, we're not trying to get people up to, performing Shakespeare, but I've seen these lessons going on the blackboards, and it's an extraordinarily wise decision that the literacy curriculum is intertwined with local needs. So, while you are learning how to spell malaria, you are learning how malaria can kill your children, and how you should be using treated mosquito netting at night, or how dysentery, which is probably a word I couldn't spell, is a common side effect of not having clean water that has E. coli in it. And so they teach them about the need to boil their water or filter their water at the same time that they're teaching them how to read and write these words in their local language. And it's so much fun. I mean, I've sat back under a tree sometimes and just watched like the interaction in the audience or of the students, and they're just so excited. They're just so eager to participate. And so I think that's why they're able to learn most of what they need to know in less than a year. Yes, Julie?
When you were talking in the first service, you mentioned that some of the people who have been in the prayer for a while, they themselves end up being uprooted. And when they have to move on to a new place because of war or,
Yeah.
violence, that they sort of hit the ground running. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the question was, what happens when people are displaced after they've received 5 talents training? And they're just extraordinary stories. Most of them come from South Sudan because I think like 20 to 25% of the population in South Sudan was displaced. And the reason that they're called displaced peoples rather than refugees is because the UN definition of a refugee is that you have to actually be outside of your own country and displaced to another country. But in South Sudan, roughly 20% or more of the population was displaced internally, and some of these people would move into these huge camps that would have like 30 or 40,000 people, all behind concrete walls with barbed wire on the top. And I originally thought that people were, living in these places like 3 to 6 months, but it turns out that the average amount of time that a person lives in a displaced peoples or a refugee camp worldwide is like 20 years. So children grow up behind these walls with barbed wire, and it's just horrible to think of how their lives have been changed for decades. But meanwhile, those who had received training and started savings groups, when they left and they moved into completely different regions, they often took their savings groups with them. Now, it didn't mean that they necessarily reconstituted with the same 20 or 25 people, but they had the same concept. And so without 5 talents having to do anything, the local leaders, the people who had been serving as treasurers and secretaries and presidents of their savings groups, they started new savings groups, sometimes inside these relocation camps or just in new villages where they were going to seek safety because of so much violence. And to me, that's the ultimate proof that we're not cramming anything down anyone's throats. They're embracing it, and they're doing things, that are just really wonderful. Yes, Jim?
Well, I promised I'd rescue you from I just want to thank you for coming, for all that you do. And I guess I'd end it with this comment, and that is when you're toiling in the pumpkin patch, now you see a nexus
Hear, hear.
between what we're doing
Yes.
and the results that we're having. So I just want to thank you for all you do and for coming. And
You bet. Thank you all. Okay.
go online, sign up, and be a contributor, and show up at the pumpkin patch.
Hear, hear.
That was extraordinary, as always.
Well, thank you. This is so much fun.
I'd just like to get a card.
Oh, sure, sure, sure.